Let's move on to the third block, which is monopolies. So that was another paper you wrote where you talked about this trend that has really it's kind of been going on, but there's this rise of monopolies happening in the market and this concentration of more power across fewer companies in many industries actually. And you sort of start with the mega cap tech companies because they're sort of front and center. They're the biggest companies obviously right now, and they're the ones where it's very clear they have some monopolistic power. But you actually show it's happening across many industries. So can you just talk a little bit about how you went about looking at this and maybe some of the conclusions that came to with monopolies in terms of how they're influencing industries and the types of characteristics that monopolistic companies tend to have?
Yeah. So if you go back to the last paper, I talked about how intangible assets are scalable, right? And how that could potentially create this winner take all dynamic where you have these tech platforms effectively become monopolies, and that's the efficient outcome actually. It would not be efficient to have 1,000 social networks. Just having a few is good enough. Well, it turns out that that's actually wrong. It isn't the case. It is not the case, as I had initially assumed, that monopolies were purely a technological byproduct. It turns out that if you kind of let's look at the example of you go to the grocery store, okay? You're looking at like the beer aisle. So I like beer. So I'm looking at different beers. And I'm like, wow, there's like so many choices. This is great. There's almost too many choices, Well, it turns out that 3 companies control 75% of all beer sold. And that's massive market concentration. They just have different names, but they're all sold by the 3 massive conglomerates. And it turns out that that dynamic exists across many, many verticals, right? From things as big as, airlines, right? There's only like 4 big carriers now in the US. The things as niche as like coffins and PET scanners. But regardless, you pick a random industry, it's quite likely that 3 companies control 80% of the market. And it wasn't always like that. If you kind of go back through time, again, I went back to my economics roots. There's a guy at MIT, I think David Autor, and his co-authors wrote a paper that was really good, where they talk about the rise of the superstar firms, in other words, monopoly firms, and they analyze the NBER data on the economic census, and they show that industry concentration has increased across all industries or most industries pretty monotonically over the past 30 or 40 years. And that's, for the empirical finding. And, it's interesting because within technology, it is the case that it's not really much driven by M&A. It's mainly driven by network effects and economies of scale. But in all the other industries, so tech's almost the exception in this case. In all the other industries, it's primarily being driven by M&A. So I have this chart here in my paper where I show how there used to be dozens of defense companies that all kind of wrapped up into a few big players. And that's been the story in like banking and cable across so many industries, and M&A has just become this massive wave of consolidation. And it makes sense too, which is if your competitors are consolidating, you need to do the same thing, otherwise they're going to squeeze you out. And as an entrepreneur, the kind of sad effect is that while these big firms are busy kind of gobbling up all the small firms, we're not really restocking the pond. Entrepreneurship has been on the decline, despite what you hear about the glorified, sexy tech entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship has been falling. Whether you measure it by the number of stocks in the U.S. stock market, or in terms of the net firm creation, both private and public, it's just been on a downward spiral. Again, this is a bit of a joke, but in 40 years from now, at the current trajectory, we're gonna have like 5 companies in the S&P. Right? Like if nothing changes. And that would be kind of a scary dystopia.
We have this slide we use in one of our presentations where we show concentration in the market historically. And what you find historically when the market concentrates is those top firms almost inevitably do terribly going forward in the next decade. There's been periods where the market's concentrated and then it doesn't. And some of those top firms don't end up doing very well. I'm wondering if you think that's different this time because of things like network effects or technology. Right now we're in another one of those periods where the market's very concentrated. And I'm wondering what you think about that. Do you think this time is going to end the way the other times ended, or do you think this time might be a little bit different with respect to that?
I think it depends a lot on what you think the reasons are for the current concentration. I think there's 2 narratives. On one hand, you have people who are kind of more, let's say, they view it as like a monopolistic kind of robber baron mentality, where these guys have engaged in regulatory capture to get through lobbying and through the creation of all this regulation made it very difficult for anyone else to compete against them. And that's like this created this fortress, this moat of regulation that will prevent them from being unseated. The other kind of side of the coin might be that it's a perfectly benign explanation, which is this is just the natural outgrowth of globalization and technology. That in a globalized world, we used to live in like many small ponds. Now we live in one massive pond. So if you're the most successful company, you now can eat the entire world, and therefore it becomes more winner take all. And then with technology, we talked about that already. So what is your explanation? If your explanation is technology and globalization related, those things are probably here to stay. Well, definitely technology, maybe globalization. And if you're on a regulatory standpoint, it really depends.